Again, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in at this time of the day in Nepal, as well as elsewhere. I would like to start by stating that I'm in no way an expert on this topic, like many of the speakers on this platform seems to be, but rather I come here to speak as a student on an issue that I care about in political ways. This is also a work in progress, and I'm still writing this paper to publish. Excuse my sloppiness throughout. This research that I'm presenting today is part of my master's thesis on conservation and indigenous environmental governance in Dolpo. I'd like to thank my advisor, Professor Emily Ye, as well as my committee members whose work have informed this paper, as well as the University of Colorado Graduate School and the Geography Department for funding the field research. My thesis presents both a resource-based and a relationship-based analysis of the ways in which state-led conservation efforts meet, overlap, and clash with indigenous environmental governance in Dolpo. The paper draws on resource-based analysis, which is to say, how are these resources contested, and which is pretty much what this paper is going to be about, as well as broader relationship based analysis of Dolpopa territorialities, which I'm not going to talk about here today, but it's equally important to understand what is at stake in these interactions between state-led conservation and place-based forms of governance. So the presentation will be organized as follows. First, I'll provide a quick overview of the context and methods, followed by a brief mention on the theoretical frameworks that inform this paper. I'll then situate protected areas in national and global context before grounding these with the discussion of the history of Shey Phoksundo National Park, highlighting its impacts on land use and resource access for the Dolpopa. I'll focus on the creation and functioning of buffer zone as a part of the broader participatory turn in biodiversity conservation and natural resource management nationally and globally. Finally, I'll discuss the contested governance of Yartsa gunbu in Dotarap, which is also my home village, to highlight the major actors and their roles in displacing indigenous-led management practices. Following other critical analysis of conservation in Nepal, particularly by folks like Sudeep Singh, Jailabrai, Stan Stevens, and others, I argue that participatory conservation falls short of its progressive narrative in practice, leading often to the intensification of state authority in ways that erases or displaces indigenous institutions, community-led resource governance, and rights to self-determination. This is a map of Nepal, of course, and it highlights the protected areas in green and light green and so on. And Shey Phoksundo National Park is in the northwest corner, right here in Dolpo. And it's the biggest national park of Nepal and it extends across two districts of Mugu and Dolpa. I conducted my field research in Cho village, which is here near the lake. It's the village that is most the closest to the Phusumdo Lake, as well as in Dotarap Valley, both of which are two major places in Dolpo. And Cho is inside the national park boundary, whereas Dotarap, which is in the yellow here, which constitute several villages such as Tokyu, Do, and Lang, is located adjacent to the national park, and it's a buffer zone outside the national park proper boundary. I'm drawing on 3 months of ethnographic field research between May and August 2019 in these two places. I conducted semi-structured interviews and participant observation as my primary methods. I also draw from my own engagements with the communities there, including being part of the designing and implementing the indigenous-led management of yartsa gunbu in Dotarap between 2010 and 2013. I was also a witness to the 2014 police violence in Dotharap, which is crucial to this paper, and I'll talk about it in a bit. And I was also involved in the justice movements organized by Dolpo in Kathmandu in its aftermath. So on June 3, 2014, a clash between residents of Dotharap and armed police force sent by the national park killed 2 locals and injured over 4 dozen more, including myself. The police brutality resulted from a conflict between the Tolpopa of Dotharap and officials of Shey Phoksundo National Park over who had the authority to collect fees from harvesters of caterpillar fungus in Dotharap region. The violence erupted after officials from the park, backed by over 50 members of the armed police force, APF, deemed the existing community-based management of yasukumbo as illegal in order to claim the park's exclusive authority to collect revenues from the harvesters. The local residents defended their right to collect fees from non-local harvesters as a customary territorial practice and as an indigenous right to manage a local resource under national and international conventions on the rights of indigenous people. Because the Nepali state had recognized the Tolpopa as one of its 59 indigenous nationalities, or Adivasi Janajati, under the 2002 Nepal Foundation for Development of Indigenous Nationalities Act. They submitted a petition to the park officials articulating, here I'm drawing from Tanya Lee, international conventions such as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the ILO Convention 169, and staged a mass protest on the site of the police violence. For months after the violence, members of the community organized a series of campaigns, including a press conference, sit-in, protests, rallies, and a delegation to the Home Ministry in Kathmandu. However, there has been no substantial response by the park or any state initiatives to redress the violence, nor were there any arrangements made to accommodate demands for indigenous management of yasukumbo in the region. Instead, the violence reinforced the state power and the monopoly of the state, of the national park to manage yasukumbo. I take this violent event and its aftermath as a springboard to discuss how and to what extent centralized conservation policies and the institution of participatory conservation affect local socio-ecological lives in Dolpo. This presentation draws from and contributes to literature in political ecology of biodiversity conservation, debates on decentralization in natural resource management, critical indigenous studies, and critical studies on caterpillar fungus. Specifically, it takes a political ecology framework that approaches conservation as both a regime of accumulation by dispossession, as well as a set of contradictory state-making practices. Political ecology employs plural theoretical and methodological frameworks. It pays special attention to the power relations and political economic structures that influence access to and control over natural resources, while seeking to uphold a normative commitment to social justice. Political ecology of conservation, while broad, is concerned with critically examining the discourses, assumptions, and the practices of territorially based conservation regimes. Drawing on a rich body of Marxist literature on enclosure and primitive accumulation, political ecologists have written extensively about the ways in which conservation constructs conceptual and actual boundaries between humans and nature. Specifically, the construction of nature as wilderness, separate from humans, which emerged during the enclosure movement in England in the 17th century and was cemented by the United Nations Wilderness Act of 1964, informs and drives mainstream conservation today. Although conservation is sometimes presented as an antithesis to the capitalist exploitation of nature, in practice, it is inseparable from capitalism. Bourgeois idea about nature conservation as wilderness, keeping it wild, have been directly linked to the intertwined process of capital accumulation and the separation of people from their land, quite literally. In a recent book, Bam Busher and Robert Fletcher aptly characterizes mainstream conservation as a paradigm that is fundamentally capitalist and deeply steeped in nature-society dichotomy. In other words, mainstream conservation commodifies nature that is at the same time constructed as separate from humans. I'll discuss the politics of decentralization and participatory conservation separately later, but drawing on scholars like Tanya Lee and North American indigenous scholars like Clint Carroll, who was in my committee, Leon Simpson and Glenn Coulthard, I take indigeneity as both contingent, resource-based political articulation emerging from specific historical and geographically specific conjunctures, as well as land-based relationalities of humans and non-humans in place. I also draw on critical social science studies of caterpillar fungus, particularly on its political economy and indigenous management practices. So this is a map of national parks in Nepal from the Department of National Parks and Wildlife Conservation, DNPWC. And just to give a context of national parks in Nepal. And so the first national parks were created in the US in the second half of the 19th century. Yellowstone sold as America's best idea, in quote, the ideal of national park based on the US Wilderness Act that I talked about earlier, travel far and wide globally. This is also called the fortress conservation because it precluded the human inhabitation of the designated protected areas, particularly by indigenous people. Governments throughout the world have adopted this model, including Nepal. The first protected areas of Nepal, Royal Chitwan, emerged within this context. Nepal's National Park and Wildlife Conservation Act, 1973, which is the master sort of the conservation regulation, instituted the legal basis for the creation of national parks and the establishment of the Department of National Parks and Wildlife Conservation in 1980 provided the central governing body for all protected areas in Nepal. Today, as this map shows, Nepal has 20 protected areas, including 12 national parks, 1 wildlife reserve, 1 hunting reserve, 6 conservation areas, which account for 23.39% of the total land area of the country. Although these areas were partitioned to protect representative samples of Nepal's ecosystems and endangered wildlife, protected areas are concentrated in the Himalayan region, as you can see here, where 5 national parks, including Shey Phoksundo National Park, which I will be talking, and 5 conservation areas constitute more than 80% of the entire region. These protected areas overlap with the territories and traditional homelands of over a dozen indigenous people, including the Dolpo. The Department of National Park and Wildlife Conservation has since implemented a bifurcated policy regarding the relationship between protected areas and local inhabitants. Following the wilderness paradigm, the existing inhabitants in Tarai region, who were often framed as sukumbasi or squatters and park invaders in discursive ways, were physically displaced from the superimposed park territories. The inhabitants of the Himalayan region national parks were, however, allowed to reside inside the park territories, with the exception of Rara National Park, where villages were displaced through a special Himalayan National Park regulation of 1979. However, there has been strict restraints on their resource use and self-governance of their own territories. Let me discuss some of these specific impacts on the resident population in Shey Phoksundo National Park. So Shey Phoksundo National Park was established in 1984 and is the largest national park in Nepal, extending across the districts of Dolpo and Mugu. The park was designed following the Himalayan National Park regulation, which allowed residents to live, so people are not displaced, but with strict restrictions on their resource use. Small group of park staff, assisted by a regiment of Nepal Army, were tasked with enforcing conservation regulations. So the military structure has been crucial to enforcing conservation regulations in Nepal. DODOLE-F and the USAID were involved through a decade-long project called Northern Mountain Conservation Program, NMCP, implemented between 1996 and 2006. It is also important to note that from its inception, the national park has not yet employed a single Tolpopa in a decision-making or managerial position. The headquarters of the national park was originally located at Pelan, near the confluence of two streams just below Phoksundo Lake. However, the Maoist insurgents set this headquarters on fire in 2004 because they viewed the park as an oppressive state structure. It is. The headquarters was thus relocated further south at Suligat, 2 days walking distance from Phoksundo, near the district headquarters of Dunai. The relocation of the park headquarters has created a distant but felt effect in the life of Dolpo. As one Phoksundo resident puts it, the park appears and disappears like clouds. This quote speaks to the paradoxical role of the park. It remains largely absent from the region, but appears with full force when it comes to extracting revenues from yartsa gunbu. The enclosure of private and common lands, which started with the establishment of the park, has nevertheless continued after the relocation of park headquarters and the implementation of participatory conservation. For example, in Tso village in Phoksundo, which is located inside the park, nearly half the households have lost their one of their registered land on the shore of the lake, which is here in this picture, part of the land. After the park arbitrarily prohibited cultivation, so these were cultivated farmland. The park reinforces material presence in the in Tso by constructing an army base on this enclosed land, as well as an office block in 1997. This is Tso village, just next to the lake. In addition to the enclosure of private registered land near the lake and elsewhere, the park has also prohibited Tso residents from the traditional practice of Sweden farming, and so that has long stopped. Tso villagers practice shifting agriculture, periodically burning certain patches of forested areas for farming, and rotating between buckwheat, wheat, potatoes, and mustard seed to increase yield, as well as to to regulate cultivation and protect from livestock. The park has since effectively criminalized Sweden cultivation and forced the locals to subsist from only the land they have titles to. And so the imposition of property rights. Since its establishment, the park has also placed severe restrictions against the collection of timber and fodder for animals. In theory, according to the buffer zone regulation, those who reside inside the park have permission to use timber for household and community needs. However, in practice, that's not always the case. And the warden arbitrarily can put restrictions against timber use, including for its urgent school project when the Tabriza school in Phoksundo was denied timber to build a classroom. The most consequential impact on local livelihood has resulted from restriction on access to and control over yartsa gunbu. Until 2001, when yartsa gunbu harvest and trade was legalized, local harvesters risked beating and persecution by the park authorities, who organized frequent mountain patrols. After its legalization, soldiers still instill fear among harvesters as they patrol bashers and erect surprise checkpoints between May and June, the peak months for yartsa gunbu harvest. I know of many stories of how harvesters sneak around treacherous mountains to avoid the soldiers, even after it's legalized. Military presence sometimes result in fatal incidents, like one in 2013, for example, when a person fell off a cliff and perished while running away from soldiers at night in Chutang, between Phoksundo and Dotara. So just to give a background about participatory conservation. So participatory conservation emerged as a specific form of broader trend of decentralization in Nepal. Decentralization itself emerged in the wake of the collapse of socialist economies and the fiscal crisis of the developmentalist state in the 1980s, and the failure of top-down conservation and resource management regimes in the 1990s. Driven by the rationales of democratization and justice and the logic that local knowledge and participation would generate more efficiency, inclusion, and accountability, decentralization entailed the transfer of power to the lowest level of governance, often through community participation. However, comparative case studies around the world have shown that, in contrast to their rhetoric, knowledge power dynamics are not always decentralized. So it's the power dynamics is the key here. It's not always decentralized. And that central states often erect barriers to decentralizing institutions, as research has shown. Nepal's version of global trend towards decentralization in resource governance took several geographically specific forms. Its widely celebrated community forestry program dominated in the Middle Hills, but not in Tarai, where lucrative commercially valuable forests made the state reluctant to devolve authority for generating national revenue. Nor is there much community forestry in the Himalayan region, more than 80% of which is occupied by protected areas. Instead, participatory conservation emerged there as a geographically specific form of decentralization. Participatory conservation in turn implied several policy changes from the earlier fortress model to allow extractive use and public participation in resource management through the creation of two specific institutions: conservation areas and buffer zones. I focus on the buffer zones here, which were created inside or adjacent to the existing national park through an amendment to the National Park and Wildlife Conservation Act in 1993. The buffer zone management rules were subsequently formed in 1996, which outlined guidelines for the formation of buffer zone user group committees or user groups at the local level, and the collection and redistribution of park revenues for community projects. The departure point of the buffer zone management regulation from earlier conservation policies was the provision to redistribute 30 to 50% of the total revenues collected by the park for community development purposes, quote unquote. Although participatory conservation policies and practices in Nepal has been lauded, celebrated as progressive, geographers and other political ecologists have produced a wealth of evidence documenting the exclusionary and coercive practices against indigenous residents on the ground. Though appearing to allow for local participation and benefit sharing, the buffer zone in fact reorganized space and expanded the managerial authority of the park warden over conservation and development programs in the buffer zones. It resulted in the incorporation of more territories and settlements into the park jurisdiction and the concomitant intensification of state authority. So this is a timeline about Shey Phoksundo National Park, and I won't go through them, but I'll just keep it on the slide in case you want to look on yourself. But Shey Phoksundo National Park buffer zone was instituted in October 1998, 2 years after the buffer zone management regulation was passed. In addition to recognizing the settlements inside the park, which were earlier an anomaly, as buffer zone, the buffer zone expanded to the adjacent territories. Shey Phoksundo National Buffer Zone extends across 4 rural municipalities and 2 municipalities today. The creation of buffer zone thus amounted to a second wave of enclosure, bringing more community lands under the jurisdiction of the park. Shey Phoksundo Buffer Zone currently includes 17 buffer zone user groups that function as grassroots organizations under the umbrella of Buffer Zone Management Committee. The user groups are further broken down into subcommittees. These committees are tasked with the dual responsibility of achieving conservation goals and implementing development projects. The programs are supposed to be funded by the 30 to 50% of the revenues the park redistribute to the community under the buffer zone regulations. To understand how this unfolds in practice, let's consider the formation, working, and concerns specific to Nasamba buffer zone user group in Dotara. Dotara Valley and its territories were incorporated into Shey Phoksundo National Park in 1998 when its buffer zone was formed. Not a single resident of Dotara I interviewed recalled the park conducting any formal meeting or consultations with locals before or during or after the process. It was declared open. In Phoksundo, given the already strict restrictions by the park, it would seem that the residents had nothing to lose and potentially much to gain by becoming a buffer zone. However, only the settlements and privately owned land surrounding it remain under the domain of the local residents. The rest of the land still belong to the park. As the chair of the buffer zone there told me, we're islands of communities in a sea of the park. During the state restructuring process, Shey Phoksundo rural municipality was only assigned an area of 123 square kilometer, a minuscule area compared to its actual size of over 8,000 square kilometers. The user groups are 11 member committees made up of local village residents. Their role, according to the park warden, is to act as a bridge between locals and the park. The park requires the chair of the user group to attend 3 annual meetings at the park headquarters. However, this rarely happens for the user groups from the upper regions of Dolpo. And by the way, when I use Dolpo, I'm talking about the upper regions, not the Dolpa district as a whole, who receive a very short or no notice at all to make the 2 to 3 days walk from the villages to the park headquarters. Although the buffer zone management regulation outlined that this redistribution should account for 30 to 50% of the park revenues, user group members told me that the actual funds are subjected to the warden's discretion. It is often the case that the entire budget is withheld due to the inability of the park to implement the programs they have outlined on time. That was the case in 2018-19 fiscal year, when the budget was withheld because of the park's inability to conduct elections to form user groups and as well as election for the buffer zone management committee, the umbrella committee. When redistribution do happen, it is much lower than 30 to 50% that is mandated by the buffer zone regulations. I couldn't get the official data on the revenue distribution from the park. However, the user groups in Dotarap told me that they received only 2 lakh in 2015, desktop computer in 2016, and a budget to construct a small office building in 2017. Although the park warden claimed that these amounts were equivalent to the 30 to 50% of the park revenue, they are negligible compared to the revenues collected from caterpillar fungus from the region, which are upward of 3 crores. Despite the inclusion of community members, the participatory model of buffer zone serves to therefore expand and intensify state authority and centralized resource governance. Local residents I interviewed accused user groups of lacking transparency and accountability to the community. As an offshoot of the park, the user groups are held only upwardly accountable, and they report back to the park officials. They are formally not required to coordinate with the elected local government nor answer to the local community. To reiterate, the user groups are only nominal and do not hold decision-making power. Participatory conservation thus unfolds on the ground in contradictory ways. Though again appearing to cultivate local participation, it further reinforces the park authority and enables the expropriation of local resources by the state, all in the name of conservation. Now move on to talk a little bit about yasukumbo governance in Dotarap. So control over yasukumbo is the central resource contention between the state and the society in Dolpo, between the park and the local villagers. Prior to 2001, the government had imposed restrictions on the collection and trade of yasukumbo through the Nepal Forest Act 1993, as well as the Forest Regulation of 1995. The government legalized the collection and trade of yasukumbo in 2001 through a special regulation called Nepal Gazette 2001. The price of caterpillar fungus has since increased astronomically, and it has become the single biggest source of cash income in the region today. So it's extremely important to local livelihood. In Dotarap, which contains nearly a quarter of the total pasture area of entire Dolpa district, which is considered the area where most yasukumbo is found and the best yasukumbo is found in entire all of Nepal, These transformations have locally experienced as an influx of thousands of harvesters from across Nepal. So in 2014, there were people from over 28 districts, and the intensified presence of non-local harvesters. The first actors who controlled yasukumbo harvest after its legalization were the Maoist insurgents, who took over the village development committees at the time, the local government, as well as the park authorities. After the Maoists left in 2006 with the peace process, the local community took matters into their own hands and developed community-based institutions to collect fees, regulate harvest, and oversee development projects on their own. This de facto control by the local community was curtailed after the violent clash with the park in 2014, and eventually discontinued following local elections in 2017. Let me walk through this timeline a bit more. So I'm going to talk about the Maoist control, which was between 2003 and 2006. So the decade-long Maoist insurgency in Nepal emerged relatively late in Dotharap, only around 2003, when several Maoist cadres came to collect revenues from yasukumbo. Revenues from yasukumbo was arguably the only reason and the major reason why the insurgents appeared in Dotharap. When they took control, the insurgents effectively terminated the local government and pushed all state authorities south. They controlled access to caterpillar fungus and monopolized trade between 2003 and 2016 by imposing a tax of 1 to 5 yasukumbo per person per harvester, and between 10,000 to 30,000 for traders to trade the yasukumbo. Of course, those who refused to pay the tax were persecuted using threats of violence. In exchange for paying taxes, the Maoists provided security to traders to cross the border from Mariumla and to the border markets in China, and promised to carry out development projects locally. The Maoists also instituted a de facto local government in the region with representatives from marginalized members of the community. They declared the dates for opening pastures with that institution and regulated social behavior, including gambling. And so there was not much gambling during that period because people were scared. Resolved conflict, provided security from robbers, etc. Interestingly, they also facilitated the entry of Tibetan Khampa traders from across the border by taking incentives or commissions. Although the Maoists spoke of equality and social change, of course, they are contradictory in practice. Community members criticized them of corruption, failing to live up to their promises, and threats of violence. This Maoist mechanism of managing yasukumbo for this period was driven by its interest to extract revenues and through using force, which set the precedence for the national park to institute its own system of extraction and coercion after the Maoists are gone. After the Maoists left in 2006, a comprehensive peace agreement, and in the absence of local government, local residents formed their own de facto governance structures between 2007 and 2013 for some significant period. They not only sought to manage yasukumbo on their own terms, but also govern pastures and farmland and oversaw mundane social matters using customary institutions and criteria for access to resources. I don't want to go too much into the specifics of the governance mechanism, but they collected revenues from yasukumbo in their territories, which are defined in traditional notions of territory in the region. For about 6 years, anywhere between 2,000 to 4,000 harvesters came to Dotharap alone, and the locals were able to collect anywhere from 20 to up to 50 lakh in revenue per year. Between 2007 and 2012, nearly half of the amount collected was used to buy subsidized rice, and which was crucial to providing food to the region that the government delivered across the border from Mariumla in China. Significant amounts were donated to the local school, to the renovation of monasteries and stupas, as well as often to pay the salary of a traditional medicine practitioner or MJ. Others were spent on communal projects, including building fences and bridges, repairing irrigation canals, waste management, community organizing and funding community events and festivals. And if there is any leftover, which were distributed equally among all households. Similar to indigenous management of Yartsa in Gorkha that Geoff Chal and Namgyal Chutup has documented, the income and revenue from Yartsa have therefore allowed many Dolpopa to increase their household income and carry out community development projects independent of state support. To be sure, the park and the state were not entirely absent, though. Instead, they operated through the local buffer zone user group and the police force. Curiously, the Nepal police officers also accompanied the local group who collected the fees during this period. Likewise, the dual role of local user group members, the buffer zone user group members, as both community members and park representatives, blurred state society boundary. These dynamics demonstrate the fact that the state is not monolithic here, but transpire in such seemingly illicit institutions and indigenous governance mechanism. And which is to say that I do not want to reinforce state and Dolpo binary here. However, the park and the district authorities were clearly upset with the local control and ultimately decided to crack down in 2014. The 2014 violence recounted earlier was an inflection point within a broader history of state-society relations in Dolpo. Since 2014, the park has progressively intensified its presence by increasing tax, completely halting the community-led governance mechanism, all by using the military force. And there's I can talk more about legal rules and regulations that allow the park, but in short, there has not been any specific policy that concern Yartsa management by the park until 2016, when Yartsa Vyavasthapan Ra Osar Pasar Nirdeshika, right, the Yartsa Trade and Transportation Directive was passed. And so these initiatives by the park have therefore rendered participatory conservation as a structure of dispossession for the Dolpopa. Dispossession here occurs as an effect of the spatial extension and the intensification of park authority through participatory conservation and implemented through coercive practices that remakes and reorganizes indigenous territories and space. So to end, according to Peluso, coercive conservation is characterized by a militarized conservation structure that appropriate the ideology, legitimacy, and the technology of conservation to violently suppress local resource users as a way to control and extract valuable resources. Participatory conservation is usually considered as an antidote to or opposite to these forms of coercive conservation. Yet the case of Shey Phoksundo National Park in Dolpo and Yartsa management demonstrate that even participatory forms of conservation can invite significant coercion, particularly when a highly lucrative natural resource is involved. In summary, the existing conservation models in Nepal and elsewhere reinforce colonial institutions and knowledge power hierarchies, colonial in the sense of where these ideas and institutional frameworks come from, as I talked earlier, and erases indigenous territorialities, lifeways, and relationships to land. Reading the history of Shey Phoksundo National Park through its implications on access to and control over valuable natural resources like Yartsa for the resident population not only reveals contradictions between the rhetoric and practice of participatory conservation, but also demonstrate the particular ways in which participatory conservation emerges as a form of as a form of coercive conservation that displaces Dolpo territorial practices. In addition to the superimposition of the park itself onto Dolpo land, the creation of buffer zones implemented as a form of participatory conservation especially extended the park authority in place that were previously outside the park's jurisdiction. And so that's the effect of participatory conservation quite spatially. And therefore, I think it's imperative to seriously consider recent calls for decolonizing conservation. Again, decolonizing is a broad term and often used in all sorts of ways. But here, it might refer to changing the terms of conservation in ways that account for the complexity of knowing and narrating nature differently and doing conservation otherwise. It entails recognizing perhaps and respecting indigenous territorialities in ways that center indigenous people themselves, their land-based practices and epistemologies, relation and ethics of reciprocity. And that is what I talk more into in the second chapter of my thesis. Specifically, the emerging paradigms of ICCAs and IPCAs and tribal national parks in North America present promising possibilities, as well as limits to decolonization. With that, I would like to end. Thank you again. Yeah, I can stop the presentation.